Bill Harms. I'm the narrative director at Hangar 13, and I was the lead writer on Mafia III. And the talk I'm giving today is called The Most Turbulent of Years, Creating the Characters in the World of Mafia III. Before I get started, forgive me a little bit. I'm fighting a cold or something, so my voice is not super great, and I'll have to rely on my notes a little bit more than I normally would. Before I get started, I just want to let everyone know that this talk deals with sensitive subject matter, including discussions of race and the use of racist language, specifically how we used it while developing Mafia III. So Mafia III, it was released on October 7th of last year on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Mafia III is a pulpy revenge thriller. And I want to say, kind of off the bat, that it's not a story, the game story is not about racism or quote unquote even curing racism. But since racism permeates so much of who Lincoln Clay is, because he's an African-American man living in the South in 1968, we felt that we had to include it in some way and address it and make it part of Lincoln's world. So like I said, you play as Lincoln Clay. He's a orphan. He's abandoned by his mother when he's around 2. And he initially lives in a Catholic orphanage run by a man named Father James Ballard. When the city shuts down the orphanage, Lincoln's basically put out on the street. And at that point, he falls in with Sammy Robinson, who heads up the black mob in a section of the city called Delray Hollow, which is predominantly African-American neighborhood. Sammy has a biological son named Ellis, and for all intents and purposes, they adopt Lincoln. He becomes part of their family. When Lincoln turns 18, he enlists in the Army, he volunteers, and he goes to Vietnam. He's there for 4 years. During his time there, he's recruited into the Special Forces. Lincoln's honorably discharged. He's actually a highly decorated soldier. And when he returns home, his initial plan is to say goodbye to Sammy and Ellis and move to California and start a new life. Unfortunately, he finds out that Sammy owes the Italian Mafia, which is led by a man named Sal Marcano. Sammy owes him a lot of money. So Lincoln decides that he's going to stick around, help Sammy make things right, and then he's going to go. As you'd expect when you deal with the mob, things don't go according to plan. Sal Marcano betrays Lincoln. He murders Sammy and Ellis, and in this scene here, that's actually Sal's son, Georgie. They shoot Lincoln in the head and they leave him for dead. And this is essentially the inciting incident for the rest of the story. From that point on, Lincoln vows revenge, and the bulk of the game is him specifically targeting Sal Marcano's organization. So when we first started working on Mafia III, we basically sat down and we tried to identify some of the key franchise pillars. And one of the most important ones that bubbled up pretty quickly is that the franchise is about capturing a specific time and place in American history, and then acting kind of as an entry point to that time and place for the player. So Mafia, the original game, was set in 1930s America. That's Depression era. It's a very different feel than Mafia II, which was primarily set in post-war America. So it's more optimistic, the future's bright, everything's going okay. And Mafia III is set in New Bordeaux, which is our version of New Orleans, in 1968. So again, it's a very, very different time and place than the first 2 games. You have Depression, post-war, and then 1968, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. But 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history, probably outside of the Civil War. So why Lincoln Clay? With the first 2 Mafia games, we already created the kind of typical mob story, especially Mafia II is the very traditional rags to riches mob story, in that case Vito Scaletta, who gets in with the mob, and it's kind of his arc as he works his way up through the ranks. And Lincoln is a very different, obviously a very different protagonist, not just because of his race as an African-American man, but also of his background. He's not somebody who was initially part of the Italian Mafia or things like that. He's very much kind of an outsider in that regard. And because he's an African-American, he has a very specific way of viewing the world. And more importantly, the world has a very specific way of viewing him. And that's something we wanted to explore narratively, which obviously lets us tell a very different type of mob story. And this also helps us reinforce the time and place. Again, American South, 1968, with an African-American protagonist. So why 1968? When people think of the 60s, they think of, I think, of several kind of massive historical touchstones, and a lot of those happened in 1968. That was the year Dr. King was assassinated. It was the year Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. It was the year of the Tet Offensive, the riots at the Democratic National Convention, the Black Power salute at the Mexico City Olympics in October of that year. So it's a very, very tumultuous time. Vietnam was also going on, like I mentioned, the Tet Offensive. It's also roughly the time when American soldiers started to return home, and the kind of rosy sheen of what was going on in Vietnam started to disappear. And social upheaval. Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, which obviously culturally had a massive impact, and this is a few years after that, so people are still reacting to that, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. The Fair Housing Act portion of the Civil Rights Act passed in 1968, so there's still a lot of things culturally going on as well. Oh, sorry about that. So why New Bordeaux? Like I said before, it's our version of New Orleans. The fascinating thing about real New Orleans is it has a very long history of organized crime, dating back to just a few years after the Civil War. The Union Army couldn't control the docks, so they basically hired a criminal to do it for them. And that basically was the beginning of organized crime. Roughly the time that our game is set, the kind of godfather of the city was this man named Carlos Marcello, and he's this larger-than-life crime boss. And if you have a moment, there's actually videos of him on YouTube testifying before Congress and literally pleading the fifth before everything. His name, what he did, the whole 9 yards. So they're pretty amazing to watch. And finally, New Bordeaux, obviously, New Orleans was our inspiration. New Orleans is a very aspirational city. It's also very iconic. So you believe that a story like Mafia III could be set in a place like that. But it also, as I said, it's very iconic. So if you see an image like this, buildings with those kind of railings and things like that, pretty much anybody can guess that that's New Orleans, regardless of where they come from. And finally, we decided to frame the entire game narratively as a documentary. So what this means is we have specific sections in the game where we quote-unquote interview characters modern day as they reflect back on the events of 1968 and what Lincoln Clay did in New Bordeaux. That includes Father James and also Nikki Burke, who's the daughter of one of the underbosses that Lincoln recruits named Thomas Burke. And then we also have a Senate hearing, which you see here, with a character named John Donovan a few years after 1968, it's in 1971. And the reason we did this is it's part of the franchise. The previous Mafia games had these, like Vito had his letters and things like that. It also grounds the story in what we think is a pretty realistic way, because it's a nice intersection between our world and the game world. We actually licensed images and video footage that played during the documentary segments, and all of that is obviously what was happening in real 1968. And finally, for the writers, it's a great way to deliver exposition. Documentaries are inherently about delivering exposition because it's a question and answer. And so it's a great way to very kind of elegantly move the story along without it feeling really ham-fisted. So this was the big one. As we developed the game, one of the most important questions we asked was how do we infuse the game with events from that era? Protests, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, and even racism, without it coming across that we're preaching from a soapbox. So we had a lot of discussions about this, and in the end, we decided to address it across multiple disciplines, which I think is a big win for the team. Obviously, my focus is on the narrative aspects of the game, but I'll also touch on the other areas a little bit as well. The team also understood that what we were doing was very risky, because if we didn't get it right, we not only do a disservice, in my opinion, not only do a disservice to everyone who worked on the game, but also to the people who lived through this specific time and place in American history. So as part of that process was research. So we really did a deep dive on researching the 1960s, specifically 1968. And that took, that basically ran across a few types of media. So I'll talk about each one of these in turn. So there's documentaries, there's movies, books, and then also firsthand accounts from African Americans. So in terms of the documentaries, the big one for me is Take This Hammer. It's a movie that James Baldwin made in 1963. It's actually set here in San Francisco. And essentially he goes around and interviews African Americans about their daily lives, what it's like to live in San Francisco, what it's like to live in the United States of America. Spies of Mississippi is about the Mississippi state government trying to infiltrate the civil rights movement. And I don't know if it's still true, but it was, I believe it's still true that it was the largest state-sponsored surveillance that ever happened in this country. And then the game is Mafia III. So, you know, we have to look into criminality and criminals and how they work. So Mr. Untouchable is Nicky Barnes. He was a huge crime figure in New York. Cocaine Cowboys, even though Cocaine Cowboys is about the rise of the cocaine trade in America in the 1980s, specifically a man named John Roberts, it again provided a nice glimpse into, you know, basically how the criminal mind works. In terms of movies, American Gangster, which was a movie with Russell Crowe and turned into a movie with Russell Crowe and Denzel Washington, about a man named Frank Lucas, who was a contemporary of Nicky Barnes. The usual things, Goodfellas, Godfather. And then since Lincoln is a Vietnam veteran, we also wanted to look into the Vietnam experience and what it would be like to serve there, and then also what it's like to come home. So Platoon, Full Metal Jacket. In terms of books, these ran the range from fiction books to nonfiction. So there's a novel called Matterhorn, which is a fictional account of basically about 3 months on the ground in Vietnam, but it was written by a combat vet. The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, which is an amazing book. And then again, touching on the criminality, the Parker novels by George Stark. The novels of George V. Higgins, Friends of Eddie Coyle, if anybody's read that. And then American Desperado. This is actually the biography of John Roberts, who I said was the subject of Cocaine Cowboys. And the great thing about something like this is you literally cannot make up the crazy stuff they did. So it provides a great glimpse, again, into that life of being a criminal and kind of where their moral compass is directed. And then Double Deal is about a man who is made the chief of police of a small town outside of Chicago, and he's placed there by the mob. And it really goes into the nitty-gritty of what that's like. And one of the things we learned from this is how much money the mob makes from illegal gambling. And a side note, he actually did more to improve the police department than any of his predecessors, and he was totally in the pocket of the mob. So I'll take a drink and let everyone read this. So for those of you who don't know who Jim Brown is, he's a running back for the Cleveland Browns. I'm a Browns fan, so to me he's the greatest football player who ever lived. He went on to be an actor and an activist. This is actually an excerpt from an interview he gave with Alex Haley, the author of Roots, that was published in Playboy magazine in February 1968. And essentially the entire interview is the two of them discussing what it's like to be an African-American man in America. I won't say that I'm using this as an example of a lot of the firsthand accounts that we researched and that we read about. But it's also, I think, one of the most visceral because literally he was driving with some of his friends and they get pulled over because their car threw dust on white people. And even though this happened, I believe, in 1957, you know, those sorts of things were still going on, which obviously has resonance in 1968. And these firsthand accounts like this did have a direct impact on how we characterize some of the characters in the game and also some of the gameplay systems, which I'll get to in a second. And finally, one last thing we did for research is we actually made a giant Excel spreadsheet that listed pretty much every major event that happened in 1968. So it was a nice thing to go back to. So for the characters in the game, we talked a lot about how to make them reflect the era of Mafia III. while at the same time ensuring that the characters didn't feel like they were beholden to history. So what we did is we started with their narrative purpose, and then the real-world history and that character's opinion of that history further defined them in terms of their personality and also the opinions they had. And then from that point on, we basically did, it's just taking creative license. I'm not going to go into every character in the game, just a few that I think kind of best exemplify this. I will say one of the big lessons we learned is do not be afraid to write characters that you disagree with. There's some pretty reprehensible characters in this game, and they were hard to write. But we felt that they were very important to include as a part of the game story because, they helped establish a specific time and place. So the first is Father James Ballard. Narratively, his role is basically he's the quote-unquote angel on Lincoln's shoulder. So he ran the orphanage where Lincoln lived for about 8 years or so, and then he also still has a place in Lincoln's life after that. And he warns Lincoln, and by extension the player, about taking things too far, about turning into the thing that you hate. But he also provides important narrative context because he fought in World War II, he was a medic, and he was part of a segregated unit that took part in the battle for a French town called Klimbach, and that was actually the 3rd Platoon Company C. And that experience is basically what prompted him to become a priest, and it also defined his worldview from that point on, not only in terms of race, but also in terms of America as a whole. And he's the primary focus of the documentary footage that I mentioned earlier. And after you eliminate each of the 3 capos that report up to Sal Marcano, we cut to Father James, and he not only provides kind of commentary on what Lincoln's doing, but he also provides relevant thoughts on what he thinks is happening in America. This is John Donovan. He's a CIA agent that Lincoln met when he was in Vietnam. The two of them, there were these things called provincial reconnaissance units, and basically they would recruit and use indigenous peoples in Vietnam to fight the VC, and Lincoln and Donovan team up to take part in that. And Father James is the angel on Lincoln's shoulder, Donovan is the devil. He believes that the ends justifies the means, and that Lincoln has every right to do whatever he needs to do in order to bring down Sal Marcano. And like Father James, Donovan's character was shaped by history. At that time, CIA agents typically were East Coast elites. They were men who went to Ivy League colleges. And that's the world he comes from. He's also violently anti-Southern, which is something that I don't think anybody ever mentioned, which is kind of surprising to me. He makes several references to the Civil War, Reconstruction, and at one point he even says that President Andrew Johnson should have hanged all the traitors after the Civil War and the country had been better off. So in other words, he's a proper Yankee. But he also represents the era in another important way, and that comes across because he deeply distrusts the government and is openly hostile to what he sees as the cronies and yes men who essentially man the levers of power. And this is a shift that really took part in the 60s as we kind of went from trusting our government to not trusting our government, and he represents that. And his attitudes really are reflected in his documentary segment, which is him testifying before a top-secret Senate panel in 1971. He absolutely loathes everyone in that room. He thinks they're all cowards and traitors, and that they put their own interests in front of the interests of the country at large. So Cassandra is, she's the head of the Haitian gang, which is initially in opposition to Lincoln, and later on he recruits her to be one of his 3 underbosses who assists him in his war against Sal Marcano. And she's a black militant, but for her it's more individualized. So her primary focus is what's going on in the city and how that directly impacts the lives of her and also the other members of Delray Hollow. So to her, the struggle for equality is deeply individualized. The other interesting thing about Cassandra is that you're either with her or against her, and this is what drives her actions in the early parts of the game, because she essentially sees Sammy, who's the former head of the black mob and Lincoln's adopted father, she basically sees him as a traitor to his race because he kicks up to a white man, Sal Marcano, the head of the Italian mafia. And this attitude even extends to other members of the Haitians, including a man named Baca, who tells Lincoln at one point, quote, "Black men shouldn't answer to white men." And it's also worth mentioning Cassandra's opinion on guns. Her open world activity is centered around obtaining them so that she can distribute them to the people of Delray Hollow so they can use them in defense. And gun control essentially has its origins in racism. African Americans were restricted from owning firearms after the Civil War, and there was a Gun Control Act passed in 1968 that was also widely seen as targeting African Americans and restricting their right to guns. So Cassandra's open world activity is a direct reflection of that. And at one point, her and Lincoln have a conversation where she even says, there's a tragedy that happens in her life, and she actually says, if I would have had a gun, that wouldn't have happened. So again, using history to very much inform her worldview. Sal Marcano is the head of the Italian Mafia. He's the man who betrays Lincoln and kills Sammy and Ellis. And one of the things that you learn over the course of the game is that Sal Marcano wants out of the so-called life. He wants to go legit. So his plan is to build a casino north of the city. And one of the reasons he does this is that he instinctually understands that the world is changing and that the old order is under assault. And that's just not the world at large. That's also including his world, which is the world of criminality, which Lincoln represents. Historically, in the late 60s, that roughly marks the beginning of the end of the golden age for the Italian Mafia in America. And Sal knows it's coming. And so the Mafia, which is essentially, at that point, an institution, like every other institution in the country, it was under assault over the course of the 60s. And it will not survive in its current form. And like I said, that's something that Sal understands. I go on and on talking about some of the other characters, like we have a woman named Nikki, and her sexuality is a part of the game. There's also a man named Emmanuel, who is he escaped Haiti, and he works for Cassandra. And so there's a part of his backstory involves Papa Doc Duvalier, who was the dictator in Haiti. And he tells the player a story about how he used to smuggle people out of Haiti, and that's essentially how he ended up in America. But hopefully you see from these examples basically how, like I said before, we used history to kind of help define who they are and let that guide some of their opinions. So the world. As I mentioned before, the story for Mafia III is not about racism. It's about Lincoln Clay getting revenge on the Italian Mafia. And we went to great lengths to ensure that we never lost sight of that very simple through line. And there are a couple reasons for this. First of all, the game is part of the Mafia franchise. And at its core, it had to be a pulpy crime story. Even though I like Lincoln Clay and I feel bad for what happened to him, he is a criminal. All of his friends are criminals. That is the world he inhabits. And like I said before, we didn't want to climb up on a soapbox and preach. Instead, we decided it's much more powerful if we made the elements of 1968 as a part of the world and expose those to the characters, and then let the characters essentially interact with that world and see what happens. And it also, we think, made it feel more real and organic. And since Mafia III is an open world game, we decided to use that to our advantage and create a city that could only exist in 1968. So pedestrians, the police, enemies, and the radio were all powerful tools that we tried to use for maximum effect. And there is some overlap in each of these areas, but I'll go through them each one at a time. So the first is pedestrians. This is actually a scene early on in the game. Those women right there are actually talking about the extradition of James Earl Ray, who was the man who assassinated Dr. King. And we wrote hundreds of conversations, and although a lot of them discussed things like the already mentioned extradition of James Earl Ray, or the biracial kiss on Star Trek, we intentionally included a lot of conversations that did not mention race, Vietnam, or anything that would closely align with that era. And the reason we did this is that if every pedestrian was either a racist, a war protester, or just talking about how the country's going to hell, in our opinion, New Bordeaux wouldn't have felt like a real grounded place. People talk about other things than just immediate history that's going on. And we also felt that it would have diluted the moments where characters in the game do discuss era-specific topics. So this is why we have folks telling jokes, There's two guys talking about their friend who had a heart attack and why he was tending his pigs, which had a very bad ending. And then my personal favorite is we actually have guys telling era-specific urban legends. So even if the player doesn't know that that's from 1968, everyone has heard of urban legend. So one of the other things as a part of that, we also have systemic lines from pedestrians that are directed at the player as they travel through the game world. And one of the things obviously part of that is racist language, unfortunately. But we tried to model it in a way that it felt natural and was based on the location of the city where you were currently at. And so the context of the city, so the likelihood of hearing those lines would go up or down depending on where you were, and this was determined by a percentage chance. So in Frisco Fields, which is a rich white enclave in the city, there's a 70% chance that racist characters would spawn. In Delray Hollow, which is where Lincoln is from, there's a 0% chance. For the other districts, the racial makeup actually played a role in determining the percentage chance of racist lines playing. So as the population of African American pedestrians increased, the odds of encountering someone who is racist decreased. We also identified pedestrians along other axes. In the game, there are 38 pedestrian archetypes, and we divided each of those along several lines. So there's income, which is, low, middle, high, gender, race, and bias, which was our term for whether or not that character was racist. That information was then used to determine where those pedestrians would spawn in the world. So there's a section of the city called River Row, which is where Vito has the protagonist from Mafia II, that's where he's located. And that's a poorer part of the town, so only low income with an occasional middle-class pedestrian would spawn there. And based on the breakdown of specific pedestrians, we actually created writing guidelines and biographies for each of those 38 archetypes in the game, which we then used to basically provide a kind of a launch pad for not only their systemic lines, but also their conversations. And this is one of them. So this is actually basically what we wrote for all 38 of those. So in this case, that archetype is named Saffron. She's racist. We explain why she's racist. And then there's Mirabelle, who's not racist, and we also explain why she's not racist. And I should note that all offensive lines in the game, racially insensitive lines, I should say, they're all on a universal timer. So if an enemy says something, it's then 10 minutes before any other character, a pedestrian, police officer, another enemy, says something that's racially insensitive to the player. So before I move on to the police, I'll talk a little bit about how we handled stores. Although segregation officially ended with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, it was still present in housing. Like I mentioned earlier, the Fair Housing Act, passed in April of 1968. And individual store owners still discriminated against customers of color. So what we did is we created a mixture of essentially desegregated and segregated stores across the city. And these are locations the player can enter. So in the case of a desegregated store, when the player enters, the person who owns that store greets them, they're friendly, ask them how they're doing. When the player leaves, they tell them goodbye. Oops. In the case of a segregated store, they're immediately hostile. They ask you why you're there, they insult you, and they tell you that if you don't leave immediately, they're going to call the police. So this loops back a little bit to the example of that Jim Brown quote, which was part of the kind of real life interviews that we read. So police in open world games generally act as a guardrail for the player's actions. So they only respond when the player is openly hostile, such as running over civilians, running around with your gun, or directly attacking the police themselves. And we wanted to keep that, but one of the things that kept coming up was how we could essentially allow the game systems to express what it'd be like to be Lincoln Clay in a southern city in 1968, specifically how it relates to the police. And again, this was all with an eye toward creating an authentic experience. So one of the big changes is that the police in our game are always watching you. So what we decided to do was populate the world with persistent police, both on foot and in cars. And unlike police in other open world games, as soon as our police see the player, they become suspicious. And that's represented, if you can see it, there's actually blue icons on the map, and it shows you that a police officer is watching you in the direction that they're, where they are from you direction-wise. If you're on foot, if the police officer is on foot, he will actually, we had systemic lines where that police officer would tell you that he's watching you. He might also warn you, tell you to move on, and get out of there. If you commit a crime and a police officer sees you, they're immediately hostile and they open fire on the player. And much like the Pedestrians, we controlled where the police spawn and increased or decreased the police presence in parts of town to make the world feel consistent. So Frisco Fields, which again is the rich white enclave, has the most persistent police, while Delray Hollow, which is where Lincoln's from, has none. And this was done, again, with an eye toward showing that, just as in real life in 1968, police prioritized certain sections of the city over others. The second part of how the police system works involves the police dispatcher. So if you're seen committing a crime by a pedestrian, they'll run to a payphone and call the police. And this is universally applied across the city because nobody wants to be the victim of crime. So they run and they call the police. What happens then, though, varies based on where you are in the city. So if you're in, again, Frisco Fields, the police dispatcher, which the player hears, will say, describe the crime that's happened, and basically say all units immediately converge, and then the police are there right away. If you're in the Hollow, it's much more apathetic. In fact, that's one of the, which I'll mention here in a second. It's much more apathetic in terms of the dispatcher's response. They still describe the crime, but then they may say something like, if anybody's up to it, go check it out, and there's no urgency behind it at all. There's also a middle ground. So our three kind of stages for the dispatcher is apathetic, normal, and aggressive. And as a part of this, the aggressive, normal, and apathetic, not only is that an audio clue to the player in terms of how the police is going to respond to them, that actually dictates how the police respond to them in the game. So the police, again, where you are in the city determines the speed at which the police respond to the crime that you've committed, with the Hollow, again, being the slowest. So just like with the Pedestrians, we have a lot of enemy conversations throughout the game, both within the missions and in racket locations. And again, they talk about a wide range of topics, but since we also wanted them to reflect on the player actions, there's also conversations about that. So there's a mob lieutenant in the game called Tony DeRazio who you throw out of a high-rise building. And so later on you may hear enemies talking about it. Hey, did you hear what happened to Tony? You know, we can't believe that happened. We need to get the guy who did it, things like that. And again, there's also era-specific conversations with them. So where they discuss what's going on in Vietnam, you know, I think there's one conversation where one of them has a buddy who's a draft dodger, things like that. But the biggest challenge with the enemies was their bark, specifically how racist they could be to the player. So the men you're fighting, we generalize obviously since they're the enemies, but by and large they're racist Southerners. So initially we pushed that as far as we could, thinking that would make for a more authentic experience. This included enemies using the most racially charged language you can imagine. But as we started to focus test the game, we received pretty universal feedback that the barks felt gratuitous and that they were there simply for shock value. So obviously that's the exact opposite of what we wanted. So as we investigated the feedback, what we learned is that there needed to be context. So while an enemy yelling out racial insults might be authentic to that time and place, it didn't make for a good player experience. So because of that, we slowly removed the most egregious barks from the game until we had what we felt was a nice balance between authenticity and context. The enemies still spout out, you know, they still yell harsh language, but like the Pedestrians, how we had specific pedestrian archetypes. We limited that language to them. We did the same thing with the enemies. So two of our archetypes, the shotgunner and the enforcer, they were the only ones that would express any racist lines at all, with the exception of the Dixie Mafia, who is basically racist across the board. The big lesson for us was not to be afraid of pursuing something as sensitive as this, but also trusting in our focus testing, both externally and internally, to help us essentially kind of navigate through and make sure that we got it right. Let's put these up here. So the radio is a great tool because it's in open world games with driving, it's pretty much ever present. Every time you get in a car, it's pretty standard for the genre. There's a song playing or a news story, things like that. And we decided pretty early on that we wanted to lean on it and use it to help expand the narrative in the world beyond the usual confines of missions and open world activities. So the first two up there, Hollow Speaks and Native Son, those are actually two radio programs that we created. They each have about 12 to 15 episodes, and they're mapped out over the course of the game. So again, we try to use them to reflect player actions and where they were within the story. The first, Hollow Speaks, is hosted by a man named Charles, the voice Laveau. And the second one, Native Son, is hosted by Remy Duval, a rich white man, who also happens to head up the Southern Union, which is our version of the Klan. And our goal with those was to offer two very different viewpoints on what was happening, not only in New Bordeaux, but also the country in 1968. And then the last 2 points is something we called the trial, which I'll talk about, and then also how we used news, both real world and news that reflected player actions. So Hollow Speaks, that's Charles Laveau right there, the voice. He's actually one of the main characters in Faster Baby, which is our DLC coming out in, I think, about a month. He was inspired by Malcolm X, specifically a speech he gave called The Ballad of the Bullet, and a man named Robert F. Williams, who was a pirate radio guy, who, if I remember right, he had a boat, and he basically just floated around offshore so nobody could get him and had a pirate radio station. And it was called Radio Free Dixie. So in the case of Laveau, unlike Cassandra, who tends to have a more local view of what's happening, Laveau views things on a much larger scale. He believes that what's going on needs to have national context, not just local context. And he agitates against the Vietnam War, drug policies, things of that nature. The other thing that he does is, although he's very much about African-American empowerment, he also understands that class defines a lot of people and the buckets they fall into too. Specifically poor white Americans. So when he talks about Vietnam, his point is it's poor people going of any race. It's not just poor African Americans who are going. So Native Son, that's Remy Duval there. He was inspired by William F. Buckley. He's a wealthy land developer. So he comes across as very genial. He's what I call a hey buddy. He comes up to you and he's like, hey buddy. He believes in maintaining law and order, agitates against social change, and uses coded language to advocate for the suppression of minority rights. So in both these cases, these two characters don't exist strictly in the radio. In the case of Laveau, he's actually, early on in the game, he's actually one of the first contacts you meet at the behest of Cassandra when you reclaim the Hollow from the Dixie Mafia. Remy is actually involved in Sal's plot to legalize gambling. He's actually the landowner and developer of the casino being built. So initially they start off on the radio, but then later on they intersect with the main narrative. And you confront Remy at a Southern Union rally. So the trial, we also wanted to use the radio to introduce kind of B and C narrative stories. And this, like I said before, this is what we call the trial. It starts off as something you hear on the radio about 4 or 5 hours in. And then again, just like Remy and the voice, it intersects with the primary narrative path at a later point. And what happens here is two African-American men, Trey McCall and Lamont Harris, they're actually driving through a section of the city called South Downs, and their car breaks down. They go to a white homeowner's house to ask for help. He comes out and shoots both of them. And over the course of Remy and The Voice, and then also the in-game news discussing this, what he claims is that he's heard about Lincoln Clay, and he thought these two men were Lincoln Clay, and that's why he did what he did. That case is being overseen by a man named Judge Holden, and at first he's kind of he's just part of that radio story, but then later on what you find out, he's also part of Sal's casino plot. He's the judge who's going to rule and legalize gambling. So at a certain point, when you're going after Uncle Lou, who runs the French ward, there's a mission where you actually directly confront the judge. And again, this was another way of, again, it's all about that time and place and trying to show how hard it is for certain people, specifically people of color, to get justice. So it was another way to reinforce that specific time and place. And finally, the news, which unfortunately I don't have a slide for. But we wrote over 100 news stories, and those reflect the actual events of 1968. And that's a wide array of topics. It's everything from what was happening in Vietnam, escalation, major battles, things of that, to Vince Lombardi retiring. And we also included around 40 stories that comment on what the player is doing. And we did this to give the player a sense of agency, that the world was understanding what they did, that the world was acknowledging it. And again, our hope, just like the documentary segments, we were hoping that this intersection of real news and in-game news would help ground the experience and create the sense that this is a real time and place in American history and wasn't something completely created by scratch by us. So in conclusion, my primary goal with this talk was to encourage other developers and publishers to take risks and not shy away from sensitive or controversial topics. And I'm not going to lie to you, working on this game was very hard. We had a lot of very uncomfortable conversations about race, about language, about our country, about our country's history, about how the world views Lincoln Clay, just to name a few. And strictly on the writing, sometimes it was very difficult to give voice to some of the most reprehensible characters you can imagine, like Remy Duval, who's essentially the head of the Klan. We have another character in the game named Santangelo, who is just a vile human being. But again, we felt like we had to include them because they provided that context and helped reinforce the time and place. In the end, obviously everyone at Hangar 13 and 2K believes it was worth the risk. We think we created a game that resonated with a lot of people. And even now, I think it's 5 months since release. There's still a lot of people, it's obvious it resonated with people because people are still talking about it. NPR did a story on the game. The New York Times actually last weekend ran a story about the game. And it's easily been the most rewarding part of my career doing video games. And that's it. So thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
We got two mics set up, obviously, in the aisles. If anybody wants to get up and ask no questions, or if they'd rather do it in the comfort of the wrap-up room, that's fine too.
Sure, whichever people prefer. No takers?
Hi. I guess I'll go. You talked a lot about how you created the world and the people within it, making sure it was very much all cohesive in a time and place. But one thing that really impressed me when I played it was that his extended family, his adopted father and brother and all those core characters. And the first, several hours of the game was getting to know them before all hell breaks loose. And I felt really connected to those characters, and I really liked them. I'm curious about, you talked a lot about creating the world and the time and place. What was your process when it came to actually creating the characters themselves and how you made that connection to
Sure. Yeah, so in regards to creating specifically, I think you're speaking to Sammy and Ellis, and by extension, I include Danny in that as well. A game, at its core, Lincoln, like I said, at its core, Mafia III is a revenge story. So in order for that revenge to mean anything, we have to feel the same loss that Lincoln felt as much as possible. So we spent a lot of time and effort to make, let me rephrase that, you can't make the player hate someone, but maybe you can make the player love someone. And if you take the people that they love out, then hopefully they feel the same loss that Lincoln felt. So like you said, we spent a lot of time on, we call that section of the game Act 1, and we spent a lot of time doing it, and I don't know how many times we actually redid that, maybe 5, 6 times, like completely over and restructuring things and moving things around. And to a large extent, it was done with that eye to ensure that when what happens in the bar happens, that the player feels at least some degree of loss just as much as Lincoln does.
It worked.
No, thank you.
Hi. Excuse me. Hi. I just wanted to say, first of all, I appreciate your work on Mafia 3 very much. And I just wanted to ask specifically, what was the cultural makeup of some of the writing teams that you worked with as lead narrative director?
So we don't, it's 2K policy not to really go into that stuff. However, those of you, I mean, there's 3 of us who are full-time. We're all on Twitter. It's me, a man named Ed Fowler, and another game named Charles Webb, who some of you may follow. Charles is African-American. So it was very important to us to make sure that we actually had voices to speak to that community. And that extended beyond the writing too. Obviously we have a very large African-American cast. And when we did the cinematics, for example, we would sit down and talk to them. Hey, does this feel natural? Does this feel right to you in terms of your experience as an American? Is there anything that feels off? Is there anything that you want to express? For example, Gordon Green, who's the actor who played Father James, I can't tell you how many conversations he and I had about Father James's sections, specifically the documentary things. We spent one time in a conference room hours going through his script and just discussing things. So it was very, very important to us, to make sure that we got that right.
Absolutely. Thank you. Admire your work very much.
Thank you.
So my question is really more about like characters.
Sure.
As you're building a character and you're planning on them not being involved very much, and then you end up falling in love with that character, how difficult is it to kind of tie them back into the storyline?
It's hard. I mean, we didn't have that problem. Let me rephrase that. That problem wasn't exclusive to the allied characters. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a lot of people, the guy I mentioned before, Tony DeRazio, who you chuck out of a 28-story window, mm-hmm. like a lot of people on the team loved him.
Yeah, that's actually who I was kind of...
total weirdo. And so we had conversations like, hey, can you go on a mission with him early on? Like, how can we expose him to the player in additional ways? In the end, what we decided was we just have to hold to the story.
Okay.
And that it'd be better to leave, better is not maybe the right word, but acceptable, I guess, to leave the player wanting more and saying, hey, you know what, that was a really cool character. I wish I could have spent more time with them, but feeling satisfied. Then it would be to go the other way and just kind of jam them into narrative places that they don't necessarily belong.
Okay.
And maybe let them overstay their welcome a little bit.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for giving this talk.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask you, you spoke a lot about the research you did to make this game, and I wanted to ask you how long of your productions was spent doing research and conceptualization?
To be honest, it never stopped.
Okay.
As long as we were writing, we were still researching.
Okay.
I forgot to mention, and it wasn't, even though the documentaries, the books, and the things like that, even though the narrative team, like we digested all of that, we also exposed it to the team at large. We actually have a theater at work, and on Wednesdays we would actually show documentaries and movies to the entire team, so that everyone within the team understood the kind of historical context that we were going for. But like I said, it never stopped. Literally up until we hit our localization deadline and we had to stop.
Okay. Did you designate a conceptualization phase before starting pre-production or production in that sense?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Did you set aside at the beginning, before pre-production and conceptualization or research?
Yeah, I mean, we tried to follow the kind of normal development cycle in terms of, so I mentioned we had this giant Excel spreadsheet. That was part of pre-production. And it was just to kind of give us a grasp of the breadth of what was happening historically. And then it was a matter of just taking that and parsing it out across the story. But like I said, I mean, you know, we'd be halfway done writing the cinematics, and either Ed or Charles or someone would find something and say, hey, this is really interesting. We didn't know about this. Is there a way we can incorporate it? And we try to do that a lot. We call them persistent character conversations. So there's these 3 characters who actually work for the bosses that you recruit. They're Alma, Emmanuel, and Nikki. And we try to use them as a way to further expose those historical elements. So like Emmanuel, who I mentioned, he's Haitian, and he escapes from Papa Doc du Valle. That actually came about pretty late. Originally, his scripts were written completely different. And then Ed kind of settled on that, you know, started going down that historical well, so to speak. And we're like, hey, this is super interesting. It helps further define who he is as a character, so we incorporated it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the fictional city in New Bordeaux and the real city in New Orleans, and sort of how you made New Bordeaux be its own thing, and where you sort of drew those lines and why.
So the short answer is that most of the accommodation we made in terms of shaping New Bordeaux was related around gameplay. So if you've been to New Orleans, the streets are pretty narrow. It's very flat. I mean, it is. That place is flat. I mean, so driving, you know, the other part of the era is driving these awesome muscle cars. So driving a muscle car down flat roads in a very narrow streets wouldn't be that fun. So that was part of it. We widened the roads to accommodate that. The other thing we also did is we added a subterranean level to the city. So there's actually canals. Obviously, New Orleans is below sea level. I think the water table is like 5 feet down or something like that. So that's physically impossible. But again, it was in the search of some cool gameplay. And like I said, we used New Orleans as our inspiration, and then kind of did what we did as we created New Bordeaux, just to kind of shape it to fit our story, but then also fit our game world and what we wanted to accommodate in terms of gameplay.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we're out of time.
Yeah, basically. So, yeah, if anybody else has questions they want to ask Bill, he can go to the wrap-up room for a few minutes, which is the pen, as was talked about earlier, over there across the hall. Poster sessions, the students will be out there with their posters. The new writers Q&A starts here in about 5 minutes. So feel free to go grab lunch and bring it in. It's sort of a working lunch session, and we will see you at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you.